Good morning, everybody. I'm Darren McAvoy, USU Extension Forester. I'm pleased to be presenting our newest edition of Wildland Stories. Thank you for joining us today. We have a little change in our format, or at least our co-hosts. We're sad that we lost our co-host, Gabrielle Harden, to another job. She couldn't resist a different position, and we wish her the best and thank her for getting us started off on this great series that we're really enjoying. Looking into the various folks that I get to work with, the faculty members here at Utah State University, in particular, the Quinney College of Natural Resources. And we're lucky today to have a co-host, my co-host Daniel Carolyn, I'd like to introduce, who might be stepping in to help ask some questions and run the technology behind the scenes. But our feature today is speaking with Dr. Kari Veblen from Utah State University about rangeland ecology. Kari is a rangeland ecologist and has a long and very interesting career from lots of different places. And we're excited to delve into that and start asking Kari some questions about her background and what rangeland ecology is all about. Hi, Kari, how are you doing?
I'm doing well. Thank you for
Thank you.
having me.
Thank you so much for joining us today. I really appreciate it. Let's just start with the basics. What is rangeland ecology?
That's a good starting question. So to define rangeland ecology, the first thing you have to do is define what a rangeland is. I think most people, if you ask them what a forest is, something comes to mind, but it wouldn't be strange if people kind of drew a blank when you asked them what a rangeland was. And so there are, of course, a bunch of different definitions of what a rangeland is, but in the narrower sense, you can think of a rangeland as these big open wild spaces that support free-ranging livestock. And so an emphasis of that part of that definition would be wild. So we're not talking about cultivated areas, we're not talking about irrigated pasture, we're talking about these sort of natural wild areas. And then, the broader definition includes not just livestock, but also any sort of free roaming ungulate. So if you think about the Serengeti, where in these areas where you don't have cattle and you just have zebras and antelope and all these other sort of free roaming animals, those also would be considered rangelands. And so because rangeland is a broad definition, that means it encompasses deserts and shrublands, forests as well, savannas, and just riparian areas, just a huge diversity of types of ecosystems.
Seems like that applies pretty well in Utah. We have quite a bit of rangelands here, right?
Yes, we do. Yep. And again, I think when people think of rangelands, probably the first thing they think of is these big, wide open, like sagebrush areas, for instance. But yeah, we also have cattle and other free roaming ungulates in forests. And, you have them in, the driest areas, the driest desert areas as well.
Let's define ungulates for folks. Does that mean, what critters does that encompass?
Okay, so, so cattle are a main type of livestock. So they're going to be one type of ungulate. And then you have, you have like sheep and goats. And those are going to be the domestic ungulates that people are most common with. But beyond that, it's a lot of these big four-legged mammals that you see walking around. So this is going to include deer and elk that you have here locally. And I mentioned also like antelope in savannas. So yeah.
So it doesn't include rabbits and little critters.
Right.
Okay, thank you. And so what does a rangeland ecologist do? How does a rangeland ecologist make their living?
Well, of course, it depends who you're working for in terms of the specifics, but most people who study rangeland ecology end up studying some combination of plants and animals, right? So looking at basically forage for animals, thinking about how they grow, how to restore forage if there's not enough of it, and then also looking at the behavior of animals, what they're eating, what kind of areas they use. And so in practice, what that means for a lot of us is going around and spending a lot of time looking at counting, measuring grass and other plants. And then I myself, because I am also very interested in the wildlife component of it, have actually spent a lot of time counting poop, animal poop.
That's so glamorous.
Yes, it is. It's one of the more glamorous parts of the job, for sure.
There's probably a long list of names you folks have for poop, right?
Yep, exactly. Yes, to try to package the description a little more sensitively. But you can actually tell a lot about what's happening in an area based on we call them dung counts usually. So I mean, I have whole scientific papers that, like half the results are based on having counted and looked at the type of dung that is there, because the dung is an indication of what types of animals are using an area. And so it's hard to use the dung counts to actually come up with any sort of estimate of how many animals or the population, what the population numbers are, because that would be really complicated. But if you have two different areas, say two different properties, and you want to get an idea of the relative differences in use between those areas of say elk, then if you have different densities or numbers of dung piles, that's a pretty good indication of the animal use of those areas.
Makes sense. How did you get involved in this field, Kari?
Well, so it wasn't a very deliberate entry into the field. As an undergraduate, I as a junior, started doing some I did a project in southeastern Arizona, a restoration project. And so we were looking at how to restore some South African love grasses to the native community. And ironically, I was working with somebody who would probably never in a million years call herself a rangeland ecologist. I mean, because even though it's not a job requirement, being you kind of you don't have to love cattle to be a rangeland ecologist, but it's helpful if you're at least cattle open and you kind of, and you're kind of interested in them. And she was just definitely not a cow person at all. It was just about restoring the native plant community. And so, but from there, it just kind of led to my interest in restoration, and then interest in thinking about how animals affect plant communities. And then I just kind of became a rangeland ecologist.
So there were a lot of steps in between. Did you, what schooling did you follow to get there? What degrees? Just rangeland ecology degrees? Is that what you
yeah, that's a really good question. Yeah. So no, I mean, as an undergraduate, I actually had a biology degree at the University of Colorado at Boulder, and it wasn't even a Bachelor of Science; it was a Bachelor of Arts. It was kind of a liberal arts education within a big university. And so I was interested in biology, and I knew I was interested in sort of environmental biology. That led me into ecology. And then I took some time off, and I was in the Peace Corps in Western Africa in Ghana. And there I was doing extension and outreach. I was trying to plant trees. And I think there is when I realized that if I wanted to continue in something biology related, I wanted to make sure that what I was doing was very useful and something that people like land managers could use and apply. And so then I came back to the US, and I thought I wanted to do restoration work. But then I ended up finding my advisor, Truman Young, who was at UC Davis. And the first thing he said is, how about a trip back to Africa? Let's go to Kenya and see if you're interested in my study site there. And so from there, I started working on looking at traditional livestock corrals and what they mean for the landscape, and then also looking at the different effects of livestock versus wildlife on plant communities. And then, yeah, and from there, I kind of continued in both of those lines of work and have ended up continuing to do a lot of that.
And that is your specialty, I gather, how livestock and wild ungulates interact on the landscape with the plants and everything else. Is that right?
That and then also restoration, sort of the other end of it. So, one part of it is thinking about, okay, so how do these domestic and wild ungulates use the landscape? And what does it, how does the plant community respond? How do they potentially affect each other through the plant community? And then the other part of it is, so if things don't go very well and the land ends up needing to be restored, how do you do that?
Cool. Well, yeah, I want to talk more about that. Um, in general, I'm really curious, and I think other people might be too, how your experiences in Africa on the Serengeti and looking through your background, seems like you've worked in, or at least been to every African nation, perhaps, and how that informs your work here in Utah, and how that knowledge, how you can bring that knowledge from there and apply it here.
Well, I think that the big thing for me was that, as a young graduate student, I went into this study system in Kenya. So this is in Laikipia, Kenya. This is central Kenya, and it's actually not a national park. It's an area that is made up largely of private ranches and then community ranches of people, and so it's inherently, because you have ranching and then you have wildlife populations, sort of this multi-use landscape. And so it's actually an area within Kenya known for its livestock production, but it's also known for its wildlife populations. It actually has the highest wildlife populations outside of national parks. And so that kind of suggests that this idea of having both livestock and wildlife on the landscape can work, right? And so to me, that's what a rangeland was, this idea of having these multi-use areas. And then I came to the United States, and well, I mean, I'd always lived in the United States, but I came to do research that was more based in the United States. And it turns out that it's a pretty similar setting. You may not know it necessarily talking to people, because you kind of end up talking to people who are more in the wildlife conservation camp, or more in the, wanting to grow grass for cows camp. But really, if you look at it, like for instance, the Bureau of Land Management, which manages huge tracts of land here in the Western US, they really have a multiple use mandate. They do, lease grazing allotments for cattle, but part of how they have to manage is to manage for wildlife. Like, so for instance, for sagebrush, that probably a lot of people, at least around here, are familiar with.
Yeah. Cool. So I think you've already told us how your passion for rangeland ecology has developed and gotten there, and you've talked about some of the places you've worked. What's your favorite place to have done rangeland ecology in the world?
Well, that's a difficult question, probably impossible to answer. I mean, obviously, working in savannas in Kenya is an amazing experience. I have two kids, and we read books, and they're pictures of elephants and giraffes, and just trying to communicate to them that I've actually, walked around among these animals while working, and did this for several years. I mean, that's a pretty stunning experience to be able to do that. And then the area where I worked has these incredibly beautiful landscapes. If you squint a little bit and kind of ignore the giraffes off in the background, it looks a little bit like some of the landscapes in southern Utah. So it's just an amazing place. But then at the same time, I just got back from a couple, or maybe 2 weeks ago, from a trip down to southern Utah, just outside of Canyonlands, the Canyonlands Research Center. And I was on the Dugout Ranch, which is managed by the Nature Conservancy, where I have some projects going there. And again, you're sitting there looking out at this amazing landscape. I mean, it's unrivaled anywhere in the world.
Cool. What other Utah-centric or intermountain landscapes do you have projects in?
Well, I have several projects, or have had several projects that are basically Great Basin based. So there are sites in Utah, but then going all the way out west, basically, bounded by the Sierra. So we have sites in Oregon and Nevada and Idaho. And so that most of those are sagebrush areas. And well, yeah, mostly sagebrush areas. And then I do have, some more projects that are in sagebrush areas here in Utah, and also in areas that are salt desert, so drier, different vegetation. And then, yeah, and then like I said, in the Canyonlands area.
And describe a little bit what those projects are. I assume they're what we're talking about, the interaction between livestock and wild critters.
Yeah, I've got a little bit of both going on. So one of the projects that is kind of coming to a close, but then I'm going to have I'm going to be starting the next phase of it, has been in southern Utah, looking at establishment of sagebrush. And that's actually one of the kind of fun parts of my research program, where it's pretty intimately related to the livestock or to the wildlife plant interactions portion, right? So we've got the animals and then also the restoration. And in that project, so in southern Utah, particularly in this area called Beef Basin, there have been these great sagebrush die-offs over the years, and there are a lot of people who are concerned about it. So there's the BLM who's managing the land, and then there's the Division of Wildlife who cares because that provides forage for mule deer. And so they've been doing a lot of restoration in these areas. And so one of the things that I wanted to do was go in and think about how might we improve the restoration efforts in there. It takes a lot of money and a lot of effort to go put sagebrush out and hope that they grow when we're talking about these really dry environments. And so with my PhD student at the time, Kyle Nearing, we went out and looked at sites that had different soil textures and depths, and looked at how sagebrush seedlings responded to those, with the idea that maybe we could find the best conditions, the best textures and depths where the sagebrush were most likely to establish and survive, and also maybe be more resistant to herbivory, herbivory by the deer that are actually eating them. And then give that information to the agencies so that maybe they could prioritize those areas for restoration.
So you found the sweet spots.
Well, we're hoping so. It turns out that it all depends on precipitation, which shouldn't be shocking to anybody outside of ecology. We know that it takes water to help plants grow, but that definitely is a big factor, is how much rain you get when you're trying to do a restoration project.
Sure. And you've worked a wide range of places. You've told us about your work in Africa and here across the West. And are there any other crazy places you've gotten to practice your field?
Well, I did, for my sabbatical a few years ago, I did get to go to Australia. So I visited the lab of David Eldridge. And, I was only there for a short trip, so I didn't get to, start some major research project, but I did help him out a bit on a project looking at the effects of horses, of free-ranging horses on the landscape there.
Well, there's a Utah topic that we probably won't get into today.
That's probably a good idea.
But how the question occurs to me, how does a young person, perhaps a young person listening to this, that was inspired by some of the things that you do and are doing, how would they pursue it? How would they come to work in your lab eventually?
Well, the main thing is getting experience doing it. Like a lot of things related to range, whether you're working in forestry or wildlife, a lot of the work takes place outdoors and you're uncomfortable. And so sometimes I have, I'm interviewing for field technicians and they say, oh, I camp and I hike all the time, I should be fine. And I have to explain that no, that's not necessarily the case, because when you're camping or hiking, you can sit under a tree and rest during the hottest time of the day, or have a snack. But really, you need to be able to work under very uncomfortable conditions, sometimes doing really boring things like measuring plants while being attacked by bugs at the same time. And so just getting that range of experience, and if people are in a place financially where they can do it, like being able to live with their parents, for instance, if there are opportunities to volunteer, that's a great way to get a diversity of experiences. Sometimes people will be, looking for volunteer field assistants that they'll pay their way, but they won't pay them a wage. And that, again, that's just a great way to get some experience.
Love that advice. Be willing to be uncomfortable. I need to incorporate that. Nobody ever told me that about forestry. It all sounded great, but they didn't talk about all the bugs and the brush and
right.
being a brush monkey and all that.
Yep. At least you have shade, though. That helps.
Yeah. Sometimes a couple of layers of shade, and you do anything for some sunshine.
Right.
What impacts do grazing does grazing have on rangeland ecosystems?
So the impacts of grazing. Well, so this is one of those questions where the answer is it depends, right? So it depends on where in the world you're talking about. But when people ask me this question, one of the first things that I think of is, okay, so what is the evolutionary history of grazing in that area? Right? If we're talking about the Great Plains that evolved with big, large grazers, then the impacts are going to be different than a place that has, say, never had big grazers or has had only very small numbers of them. And so, in these places, so for instance, in Kenya, in the savanna system where I worked, clearly it evolved with lots of large grazers. And so, it also depends on whether you're talking about native animals versus domestic animals. In theory, the idea is that if you have native grazers, that they should be able to kind of maintain some sort of balance. I mean, I don't really like to use that term, but if something resembling what naturally would have been happening before humans really intervened. And then when you add in domestic grazers, so we're talking primarily here about cattle, then what you really need to start thinking about is their numbers and their behavior. So one thing about cattle is that they're often stocked at really high densities compared to wildlife, and they may not move around as much. And so you can imagine that means they may have a greater impact on the landscape. And so I think a common theme of a lot of my work in Kenya and to some extent also here in Utah, and certainly what other people have found, is that when cattle in particular, which I know many people are concerned about, are stocked at more moderate densities, it can work. But again, that's all tempered by what the evolutionary history is, and just and also what the condition of the land is in the first place.
So this ties into something I've been wanting to ask you about for a while. Is I've just been associated with people who've been enthusiasts of the Savory grazing, holistic grazing method and approaches for most of my career, and I just want to hear your take on that and how it resembles your work or your work relates to that sort of thing.
Yeah.
And please explain who Alan Savory is to our audience.
Okay, so Alan Savory is the fearless leader and proponent of holistic range management, holistic grazing management. I think, I believe it's Zimbabwe is where he comes from. And he, over the years, and this is decades now, has developed this holistic range management program, and it has a huge following. A lot of people who are really, interested in and passionate about managing rangelands love it and are huge supporters. And then I think probably one of the reasons that Darren has asked me about this, but then there are also some people who just really do not subscribe to the point of view and are uncomfortable with some of the things that he says. And I have to admit I myself am not super familiar with the whole program that he promotes, because I know that has a lot to do with like whole farm management and thinking about planning and, I think financial components and diversification. But the part that I am a bit more familiar with is the grazing component. And that's also, I think, the most contentious component. And so, and again, because I'm not I'm not part of the whole program, I'm not going to be able to tell you exactly what the prescriptions are, but a big part of it is this idea of having high intensity, short duration grazing, which means putting a whole bunch of animals into an area and just like having them eat everything. They're stomping all over the place. And I think that the idea is that, in these places, well, I think it's based on places that have evolved with lots of hooves and lots of animals. And so the idea is that you do that and then you move them, and that's actually good or better for the landscape. And it's a very attractive idea, just this idea that you can go in and really use up the landscape. But there, has been, like I said, it's been a bit of a contentious issue because my take on it is that a lot of the conclusions and recommendations that have come out from this are not particularly based in science. And as scientists, we like replicated studies. We like to see the scientific study behind these different claims. I mean, if it worked in one place, as a scientist, we say, okay, that's great, but we need to see that it works all over the place, and we need to, to really feel confident that that wasn't just a fluke. And so, and then also, related to that is that, you can imagine that it would really, that how well this approach works depends on where you are. And again, and my impression is that this high intensity, short duration grazing is meant to be, is something that they claim can basically be applied almost anywhere. And that seems very unlikely to be true, that's possible.
Like you said earlier, the answer depends. It always depends. And that is
No,
our favorite answer here at the university.
It's true, and I actually talked with a landowner who was a big proponent of the, what they call the Savory method. And, for years I heard him saying how great it was. And then finally I pressed him and I said, so you really are just following exactly, what you were sort of basically what this prescription is of what to do. And he said, well, no, I'm kind of making some modifications. What I really value is that it taught me to think differently and to try different things. So,
yeah. Good lesson.
Yeah.
Yeah. How can rangelands be restored after heavy livestock grazing?
Well, now that's the $1 million question. We're all trying to figure that out. There are a lot of people working very hard to figure out how to restore.
Is that the question that drives a lot of your work?
Yeah, it drives a lot of my work and a lot of land management, in the West and in rangelands. I mean, and I, because I do live in the West and work in the West, focus a lot on public lands. So these Bureau of Land Management lands that I've mentioned. And so for context, these are huge land areas. So we're not talking about a small preserve where you can go in and spend all kinds of money and energy and visit the place and really restore the area. I mean, because if you have a really small area and enough resources, it seems like anybody should be able to restore it. But we're talking about how do we operationalize this over these huge landscapes with as little, trying to, be as budget conscious as possible. And so it's hard. And that is why it's the $1 million question. And you have a lot of people trying to figure out how to do this. So And so your original question, I think, was, so if you have heavy grazing, what do you do to restore? So the first thing is to figure out if it is in fact grazing that is causing you to need to restore, right? Is that the stressor? Is that the problem? And that's important because, I mentioned before, these are multiple use lands. You've got ATV use, you have mining, and you have these free roaming horses as well. I mean, so you need to figure out, are the cattle the problem, if that's what you're interested in. And so assuming they are, the first thing to do would be to remove those cattle. Yeah, you remove the stressor, right? And then the next thing you do is you go in and you after you've removed that stressor, that's when you go in and you start to try to fix things. So it might mean trying to, depending on the situation, it might be stabilizing soils, right, in order to just even help plants to grow at all. It might be going in and doing some control of invasive species, some undesirable species that aren't really useful to anybody, and get them out. But then once you do that, you've created this space and you've gotten rid of the bad plants, for instance, then you need to go in and try to establish the good ones, the desirable ones that people want.
Yeah, it sounds like that could be expensive on big landscapes.
Yes, it is definitely expensive.
And there's examples where people use grazing to sort of turn things around for after heavy grazing. I've seen BLM examples from Nevada presented at Restoring the West conference in the fall. And do you have any comments about that?
So what do you mean by turn things around?
Well, a lot of photos of bottom lands that had no riparian vegetation, and they changed their grazing methods, and they have riparian vegetation now.
Yeah, well, so that probably sounds like a situation where maybe you've changed your grazing system and tried to keep the livestock out of the riparian areas. But and we could certainly go back to talking about grazing systems, but there are certainly cases where people are trying to use livestock as tools for restoration, right? So one of them is people have been working on trying to use we're calling this targeted grazing of cheatgrass. So cheatgrass is this invasive annual that's ubiquitous throughout the Great Basin and not really useful to anybody, right? It's not good cattle forage, and it's not a native plant, and it creates this fire cycle, and then you end up losing the native community, and most people don't want to lose your native plant communities. And so people have been working on trying to get cattle to graze on it during a time period when it does offer some nutrition, to partially to restore, but also to try to reduce fuels so that the areas won't burn anymore. So, that's one example, and then another example that I worked on previously here with my student, Brittany Duncan, and then Karin Kettenring, who's in our college and who studies wetlands, is we actually experimented with using cattle to restore Phragmites. So if you've ever seen Phragmites, there's a big invader of wetlands, and including here on the Great Salt Lake. And so basically some of the managers around here have been trying to use cattle to go in and get rid of the Phragmites for restoration, because especially when you're dealing with these urban areas, it's hard to get clearances to burn, and and in some ways there may be less impact than using herbicides, and plus it's a way to provide some forage for cattle, but for certain cattle who are used to being in wetlands and eating Phragmites.
Oh, I think I'm pushing you too far towards that grazing thing. Let's talk more about your specialty. And let's introduce wildlife into this, wild ungulates, and how do they change this mix? And so if you remove the cattle, or lessen or change the cattle, how can you do that with wildlife, or how would you talk about those impacts and those interactions, please?
Okay, well, a couple of things come to mind. So one is actually in that same vein of what I was talking about with using cattle as tools for restoration. Is in a project with Juan Villalba and Eric Thacker, who are also both in the department here of Wildland Resources. We've actually been trying to work on figuring out how to use elk as a way to sort of restore and improve stands of sagebrush. So a lot of the work that Juan Villalba has done is getting cattle to eat things that they wouldn't ordinarily by supplementing their diets. And so that's his whole area of expertise. And so what I was interested in doing was thinking about how can we potentially use elk in a similar kind of way, and maybe even a way to sort of entice them to move around the landscape. And so that's something we've been working on. We had a project that we've gotten some preliminary work done at Deseret Land and Livestock, where we basically put feeders out of diet supplements for elk in order to make it more attractive for them to want to eat sagebrush, in order to try to reduce the cover, because sagebrush in some places can become overabundant. Yeah, I mean, and then yeah, and so yeah,
that's one example. You said you had a few things come to mind.
Yeah, I'm trying to think.
I'm
trying to remember what my other example that I was going to say of using wildlife.
Just how wildlife interacts with cattle and livestock, and when you change one, how does, I mean, if you take the cattle off, does that bring more wildlife in, or their interactions?
Okay, that's a good question. That is what I was thinking about. Thank you for the reminder. So yeah, again, going back to the research I've done in Kenya, and this is part of the Kenya long-term exclosure experiment. It was actually started by my PhD advisor in the mid-90s. So this
what's an exclosure? Excuse me.
Oh, thank you. So an exclosure it looks exactly the same as an enclosure, but it does the opposite thing. So it would be a fenced area that is intended to keep animals out.
Why? Why would you keep animals out of a perfectly good grazing spot?
That's a good question. And actually, if you look at exclosures here, like long-term exclosures set up by the BLM and Forest Service around here, often the exclosures get clipped so that people can put their horses in. So a lot of people think like you, Darren. So that's a very good question. But exclosures are a tool for basically looking at what would happen to plants, soils, insects if you took away the big animals, right? And so in Kenya, and actually have some similar study designs here in the Western US, you have these different types of exclosure. So you have one type of exclosure that keeps out just cattle. Then you have another type of exclosure that keeps out cattle and wildlife, and you can have all these different combinations. So in Kenya, it's different combinations of cattle and wildlife, and then the big wildlife, which are the elephants and the giraffes. And so basically, by doing that, you can go and look inside these individual exclosures that basically have these different herbivore regimes, right? Like, you're kind of simulating, this is what the world would look like if we had no herbivores. This is what we would look like if we had only cattle. This is what would look like if we had just wildlife. And here's what it would look like if we have them all together. And you can see what happens. And in this case, you can see what happens over the long term. And the impetus for this particular study was to look at competition between cattle and wildlife. And in this area, a lot of it is perceived to be competition between cattle and zebra, because they tend to eat the most similar food and be in the most more similar numbers. Like there are a lot of zebras, basically. But it's kind of a big assumption just to assume that they compete with each other, and that they're therefore incompatible because they're just eating each other's food. And so some of the work that has come out of that exclosure experiment has shown that yes, in fact, they do compete. So in these areas where you have cattle, you do tend to have fewer zebras, probably because they have less to eat. But then the opposite is not necessarily true. And in fact, one of the things that we found that's really interesting is that it can get really complicated. So for instance, in these areas where elephants were, it seemed like they basically reduced some of the negative effects of cattle on zebra. So basically having the elephants there encouraged more zebras to be there. And so maybe the first thought you're thinking is that maybe the elephants are running off the cattle, and maybe that is what's happening to some extent. But what we think is probably happening is that elephants really like to eat forbs. And so forbs are this made up word. So they're basically all these the low growing, not woody plants that you see growing that aren't grasses, right? So like the wildflowers basically that you're seeing out there. And so elephants like to eat those, but so do cattle. And so no, our hypothesis is that maybe because the elephants are eating those forbs, the cattle don't like to be there as much. So they are going elsewhere, and that in turn encourages the zebras to be there.
Cool. I like this question from our viewer, Karen Mock, who's familiar with it, to us. What are some of the positive shifts you've seen in the management of Western U.S. rangelands in recent years?
Well, I think that, one of the things that certainly is positive is people thinking about how to manage livestock. I mean, people have always thought about how to manage livestock, of course, but as people have as we're dealing with droughts and shortages of forage, I think that you have a lot more people thinking harder about it outside just the management community. You have scientists trying to figure it out, just like, what can we do? And I think one of the themes that is emerging is that when it comes to managing livestock, there's a lot of contention about how best to do it. We talked about this Savory method of, it's like you do your high intensity, short duration, and other people will talk about like maybe you go and you actually try to herd your animals around to kind of keep them in the areas that you want them to be in. But one of the themes I think that's emerging is that I wouldn't say any management, but close to any management can be good management. So basically, if you're just, instead of just sort of letting the animals out to do their thing, if you're trying to actively manage in some way, then it often is helpful for the landscape.
Do herbivores provide any benefit to the plant communities?
Yeah, I mean, and again, you go back to the question of evolutionary history, right? So in an area that has evolved with big herbivores, if you take them away, it's probably that plant community is probably going to completely diverge and look like something completely different, right? And of course, this is based on the idea that you want things to basically stay the same, but again, I can just tell you, and this is from having this great long-term experiment where we've excluded, certain types of animals for, at this point, 25 years, that in Kenya, where you have these areas in Kenya that has evolved with large herbivores, when you take off the herbivores, the plant community completely changes. So what happens is these, some plants typically would get grazed, right? And so then that maybe reduces their ability to compete. So that gives other plants the chance to survive, to grow, to establish. But if you take that away and you don't have the herbivores eating those plants, then you end up with those plants dominating, and it doesn't allow these other ones to come in. And so you end up just basically just shifting what your plant community looks like and what the dominant species are. And so if your idea is that you want it to basically maintain a semi-natural state, then in that case, certainly there's they're having having a positive impact. And then I also, talked briefly about people using them as tools as well. I mean, the key really is that, is basically all of these systems are adapted to some sort of disturbance. And then the effect that grazing has on it is going to depend on how well, or how that grazing mimics whatever disturbance it is that the system has evolved with and basically needs.
So grazing is a disturbance.
Yeah, you can. Yep.
Mm-hmm. I like this question from our viewer. Thank you, Gregory. In southern Utah, where sagebrush is dying off, is it being replaced by other plant species, or is it total vegetative cover declining?
So that's a good question. And so in the areas where sagebrush are dying off, you're not really going to be getting other woody species coming in. And so that's one of the reasons we care about it, right? I mean, not we, but the big we care about it in terms of being able to, create forage for wildlife, and in terms of just basically maintaining the integrity of the landscape. I mean, in most of these places, something else will, unless it's been severely degraded, something else will probably take its place. And it may be just some plants that are more adapted to disturbance. And so, just like some of these grass species that can just, grow on almost nothing. But then in the not so great case scenarios, when you do have different levels of degradation and you have increasing droughts, it could be undesirable species that are coming in to take up space. So, something like cheatgrass.
Here's another good question from our viewers from Cullen. Thank you. How do you suggest that land managers monitor the effects of management system on their private land?
That's a great question. So it's monitoring the effects of their management
on private land, and is the question.
Well, the first part of that is that most people who are managing lands, by simply being out there, have a pretty good sense of what's working and what isn't working. And so so that's kind of the first fallback. But then in terms of actually doing formal monitoring, I would actually check out the Jornada the Jornada Experimental Range website, because they have a whole section, like a whole web section on monitoring resources. And these monitoring resources have been put together by multiple different agencies, and the idea is that they're meant to be accessible both to like, say, federal agencies, but then also to people, like to the rancher, and then to everybody in between, to be able to do them. But hopefully everybody is using similar methods so they can kind of talk to each other. And then some of them are definitely, some of the resources definitely are geared towards saying, well, if you don't have, if you have a day job and you don't have, the time to be doing this intensive monitoring, here are some sort of, easier, quicker things that you can do. And so I would definitely refer to those handbooks. I refer to them. A lot of people in rangeland ecology actually use those as standard methods.
Thank you. Here's a question. What's your least favorite thing about this field?
My least favorite thing. I think my least favorite thing is trying to get plants to grow when there is no water. So from my perspective, it's hard to do research when the plants aren't growing. But then, for the people and the animals that depend on them, and the agencies trying to do it, it's incredibly frustrating.
So no mention of dung counts or mosquitoes or any of that.
Dung counts are fine.
Okay, we're going to shift for the last few minutes into our registrant questions that they listed for us. Okay. Can you discuss the changes in grazing practices due to invasive plants and to climate change and soil aridification?
So I think the biggest adaptation there is to adapt to less less forage availability, right? Because all of those things that you mentioned basically amount to less grass growing, right? And so if you're managing cattle, then that's a problem, right? Because you're trying to feed them off of the grass that's growing there. And so so necessarily what's going to have to happen, and in some cases it does, and maybe some cases that others it doesn't, is either having fewer animals on the landscape, or trying to change when they're there, or change how long they're there, in order to have try to minimize or moderate the impacts on the forage resources that you do have, so that you don't end up overstressing them and then ending up with less than what you started with. And then certainly coupled with that would be doing active restoration to try to establish more plants where you have lost them. And one of the things that a big part of my research program for the last several years has been trying to promote this idea of doing active restoration sort of before you really think you need it. So, when these big areas in the Great Basin burn because of cheatgrass, and then you end up with a Martian landscape, everybody realizes that you need to restore at that time. But arguably it could be too late at that point, right? I mean, because especially if you're, you get some drought years and it's just not a successful restoration, it's a pretty big risk. And so one of the things that I've with some of my collaborators been trying to promote is this idea of maybe we should go into these areas that are in kind of moderate condition, where things are kind of starting to go downhill, and try to restore in those areas and see if we can shore those up. And so that would be, again, a response to the these stressors that the registrant mentioned.
Yeah, it makes sense. You don't remodel a completely dilapidated building. It's you start with something that's decent. And thank you, Daniel. We have a poll up. It'd be great if you guys could fill out that poll. We're just going to take a few seconds to do that, and we really appreciate your participation. It's really helpful to our program to know what you are learning and what you're getting out of this. This is how we continue to do this sort of work. In the meantime, I want to ask you this question, Kari. It seems really very much up your alley with your combination of wildlife and grazing livestock. But if our registrant asks if we replace cows with bison, as livestock, would this be a good alternative in terms of benefiting the land?
That's a really good question, and it's a question that people have been asking, like research-wise as well. So, and again, I'll go a similar refrain. There's it depends, and there's the evolutionary history, right? So if you're in an area that, historically was grazed by bison, and if you can ideally graze your cattle in similar ways to the bison, right? Meaning like have them, come through at certain times of year instead of being, just being, contained to a smaller pasture, then you may very well be able to simulate what happened historically. And again, in theory, it should work. The reality is that there are all these other sort of factors, right? Things have changed. We have smaller land areas. You can't really let them go and be free roaming. You have invasive species, but but there are some elements of having bison versus cattle that people have looked at. So Sam Fuhlendorf, who is at Oklahoma State University, has actually looked at this very question and found some interesting things, like that basically bison are more tolerant of the heat, and maybe they don't need to hang out in the shade as much. And that's one of the big issues with livestock, is they go and they hang out in the shade next to riparian areas, and that's where you end up having degradation. So there certainly could be some benefits to that. And then another would be how far the bison can roam from water, right? And so that means maybe they have less, maybe they would have less impact on those areas. And that actually is a good segue to me for me to briefly discuss a project that I'm just getting started. And this is so down at the Dugout Ranch at the Canyonlands Research Center with the Nature Conservancy and then collaborators at USGS, we're actually looking at Criollo cattle. So they are a heritage breed of cattle. And again, people down at the Jornada have started looking at them in that region in the Chihuahuan Desert. And then we're interested in seeing how they might be compatible with the landscapes down in the Colorado Plateau, because in some ways they're kind of more wildlife-like. So kind of like the question. So we're not talking bison, and they are still cattle, but they're a little more like wildlife in their behavior, in that they can go farther from water. They're a little bit hardier, so they can go in slightly more difficult terrain. And so what that means is they're smaller as well. And so what this means is they might have less impact on the landscape, and maybe be able to go farther out from water and use a greater diversity of forage resources, especially when the main ones that cattle use are more scarce. Like if the grasses are more scarce, they may be able to eat shrubs a little bit more. But of course, this, along with the bison question, it's all within this broader context of what's sustainable for the people who are doing this for a living. So, what does this do for their bottom line in terms of profit, in addition to being able to, have a sustainable operation environmentally?
Thank you. I want to back up just a little bit and define riparian. It's a word we've used a few times. It's the area along the streams where the wetter vegetation tends to grow. Another interesting question: which native plants will suffer the most from exceptional drought in Utah? And I want to add to that, which of these wild ungulates, or maybe it's the farmers and ranchers that are going to suffer the most. But yeah, just what's your take on that?
So, so the types of plants that are going to suffer, the first thing that comes to mind is going to be thinking about, say, grasses and these, herbaceous plants versus woody plants. And it's going to be the herbaceous plants, because the woody plants, they're bigger, they have deeper roots. And so when we have drought, it's the top layers of the soil that are going to be drying out and not having water available to plants. And so the woody plants can reach water at deeper depths. And so they should be better off. And they can also do it in the winter. A lot of them can do it in the winter, whereas grasses are not going to be doing that. And then if you shift to thinking about like within the grasses or the herbaceous plants, we kind of divide these grasses into two types, into cool season and warm season plants. And so the cool season tend to thrive and kind of get going physiologically in cooler temperatures, and the warm ones in the warmer temperatures. And so probably it's those cool season ones, as we have warmer temperatures and droughts, it's probably those cool season plants that are going to suffer the most.
You added a piece of knowledge, I think. For me, when people ask me why have juniper taken over so many landscapes in Utah, I talk about a few other things, but I don't talk about the woody species being more drought tolerant than the vegetative species.
Yeah, I mean, it's a little counterintuitive because you think the woody species probably need more water, right? But yeah, I mean, a lot of it, and this is something I've been thinking about a lot, is where are they getting their moisture? And that turns out that the top layers of the soil are a tough place to be trying to get your moisture when it's a drought.
Makes sense. Yeah, it's a new way of thinking of it for me. One of our last registered questions that we'll have time to get into: how will drought conditions affect cheatgrass health, spread, and seed viability?
Good question. I mean, if the past is an indication, cheatgrass will probably continue to be a machine and thrive, unfortunately. I mean, I'm hoping that's not the case. We were just talking about what happens with drought and in the native plants, like in your native woody and herbaceous plants. If you lose those, it creates space. And so it creates areas that cheatgrass can colonize or spread into. That being said, and if you can imagine, maybe it's an even worse situation, is that sometimes when the level of degradation is great enough, cheatgrass gives way to even worse, weedier species that you really don't want, that are associated with, you know, much less stable soils and just kind of a downward spiral. So that's a possibility too, right? If it becomes too if it becomes inhospitable even to cheatgrass or to other annuals that behave like it, then it could get worse.
There's things worse than cheatgrass.
Yep, yeah, there are. If you can believe that. I feel like we need to end on a more positive note, though.
Thank you. Please do.
Well, I'm not sure what it is.
Well, you're doing lots. You've already pointed out a lot of positive things that are going on in public lands all over Utah, and I think spilling out onto private lands, and the restoration of rangelands. And yeah, any last word on restoration and what the future might look like?
Well, I think just, building on what you said, there are a lot of people who are really dedicated, who are really, thinking about innovative ways to manage and to, manage their livestock, and restore land, both, private people, agencies, researchers. And so, yeah, hopefully that'll do the trick.
More management is going on with your help. Really appreciate it, Kari. Thank you for all your time and all your sharing all your insights today.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
And we appreciate our audience. And thanks again to Daniel Carolyn for all the tech support. And another thank you to Gabrielle Harden for getting us started down this road. And thank you, everybody. I hope everybody has a great rest of your day and weekend.